Welcome to Prevention Through Connection. I'm Cathy Samuels, Project Director for the Manhasset Community Coalition Against Substance Abuse, also known as CASA. Tonight's program is a special edition of Prevention Through Connection, and it features Dr. Stephen Dewey, his alcohol, drugs, and the teen brain. But before we begin, Manhasset CASA's Youth Committee Club's Vice President, Sara Wong, will just address you a few minutes with regards to safe medicine practices.
Yes, okay. So Manhasset CASA has received a grant through the Cardinal Health Foundation. We're working together with many partners across Manhasset, including our own youth club, the town of North Hempstead and Nassau County, to help everyone understand how to safely use prescription medications in an effort to prevent their misuse. So let's begin by understanding how medications can help us. They can help us lead a longer and healthier life when used correctly. They also help with our life expectancy, which is the longest in history, and we are preventing and curing many illnesses than before. However, these life-saving medications can also be very harmful when misused. So what is considered misusing medications? First is taking more than prescribed. Second is taking the medicine for a reason different than prescribed. And lastly, sharing or taking another's prescription medication. Unfortunately, the CDC calls the prescription drug misuse a national epidemic. Research indicates that millions of Americans misuse prescription drugs by taking them differently than the prescriber intended, and thousands do so for the first time every day. This epidemic affects all of us. There's no stereotypical type of person susceptible to prescription drug misuse. It occurs in rural and suburban communities among all of those in different socioeconomic statuses. So why are we so vulnerable to the misuse of prescription drugs? Well, we believe there are several factors to this. The first is that we are a drug-taking culture. The second is that drugs are easy access without a prescription. There are many misperceptions about drug use and the legality and the safety of them. People have different prescribing practices these days. The media, mixing drugs, the pressures facing the youth, and the issues of care. So how does the misuse of prescription drugs impact our community? There are many different consequences, including legal, social, and health consequences. The legal impacts include that many misused drugs are called controlled substances, indicating that there are even stricter prescribing and dispensing regulations for their use. Socially, the misuse of medications affects our family, friends, and community, as well as our job, education, our finances, and much more. And lastly, the health impact and most tragic consequence of prescription drug misuse affects our health and includes drug overdose deaths, which is a leading cause of accidental death in the United States. Death is not the only health-related consequences. Not taking your prescription as directed by a healthcare professional can result in immediate negative effects. However, there is good news, and we can make a difference. Prescription drug misuse can be prevented, and prevention starts with us. So how can we prevent prescription drug misuse at home and in our community? We can stop this epidemic by following 4 key safe medication practices. First, remember to only use prescription medications as directed by a health professional. Many overdoses result from mixing medications and with other medications or with alcohol. Follow the dosing instructions provided by your doctor. And lastly, talk with your doctor or pharmacist if you feel that you need adjustment with your medication. Secondly, never share your prescription medicine with others or use someone else's prescription medication. There are different factors that can affect us, such as genetics, weight, and pre-existing medical conditions. Engaging in behaviors of self-diagnosis and self-prescribing is very dangerous. And also, regardless of your intention, sharing or taking someone else's medication is not safe. Third, we should keep our medications in secure, safe storage and have better disposal practices. When prescribed a prescription medication, store them in secure locations and lockable spaces, and avoid storage places where children and other people can find them and have access. When finished with your prescription medication, you can bring it to a Nassau County Police Precinct, and the disposal box is in the lobby. There's a card in the table back there. You can grab it, and it will give you directions on how you can safely dispose of them. Lastly, it is important to be a good example to those around you by modeling safe medication taking practices. When appropriate, discuss these dangers of misusing prescription medications with your family, friends, colleagues, students, or patients. And we call Manhasset CASA a safe medication practice, and we have a Fact Life card also available in the back. And if you have any questions, you can see me after tonight or Miss Samuels. She is over there, she's waving. You can see her. And now we're going to introduce Dr. Stephen Dewey. And this week is National Drugs Fact Week, and it's a health observance week for teens that aim to shatter the myths about drugs and underage drinking. Tonight, Dr. Dewey will present us with the facts and just the facts about how the teen brain responds to alcohol and drug use. Dr. Dewey is a native Long Islander and a graduate of Fairleigh Dickinson University. After completing his grad degree in medicine at the University of Iowa, and his postdoctoral fellowship in the neurology department at Stony Brook, he joined the medical department at Brookhaven Lab. For the past 24 years, Dr. Dewey has been conducting research on the effects of addictive drugs on the brain. His research program is now at the Center for Medical Research, called Feinstein Institute at North Shore LIJ. And Dr. Dewey has appeared on 2020, Dateline, Good Morning America, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, and Newsday. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dewey.
Well, it's really nice to return. I must say that I've been doing this for a really long time, like almost 40 years, and I'm really impressed with the way you guys handle things here in Manhasset, and I really think it's a tribute to Cathy that she has been doing this over and over again. And it's a real credit to the community that you turn out, just to learn a little bit about what we're doing. So I appreciate the opportunity to come back, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work I do, literally a mile from here. About myself, you heard I grew up on the island. I went to college in Jersey, medical school in the Midwest, came back to New York. And I've always been interested in the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain forever, for as long as I can remember. And many years ago when we started doing this work, we were, for those of you that in the science business, we disseminate our information in publications to our colleagues. Well, in my field, it's probably just as important, if not more so, to disseminate what we do to non-scientists, to the community, because the work we do in research and substance abuse impacts the community. So a long time ago, I was president of my board of ed. I live on the east end of the island. It occurred to me that I probably should just go to my local school district that I was the board president of and talk to the kids about our research. Well, that was my district way back then was 420 kids, K through 12. So it was a small district. And in the early 90s, that first year I spoke to 400 kids. In 2016, we topped about 160,000 kids. So it's something that's important to me from as a volunteer to get out and kind of disseminate our science to kids, and that's what you'll hear tonight. I'm obviously very laid back, so if you have questions about anything you see or anything I say, ask. If you don't believe what I say, you can ask me too. I mean, I've been doing this so long. So I work at the Feinstein, which is the research arm of what used to be North Shore LIJ, but it's now North Well Health. We have an imaging center there where we study the effects of addictive drugs on, as you'll see, animal brain and human brain. The way we do it is really quite simple. We use an imaging technique. It's a technique that that you're probably familiar with. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the traditional imaging techniques that are out there, CT, X-ray, and MR. These are basically just cameras that take pictures of your body. This is a CAT scan of someone's abdomen. These circles are tumors, cancer in the liver. This is a young lady who magnetic resonance MRI of her brain. Her eyes are right here. And these little white spots are a disease called multiple sclerosis. And X-ray, someone's forearm, these are compound fractured bones are poking through the skin. So the reason I show you this is just so we can kind of get on some common ground with the way I do what I do. Well, if you think about any disease, doesn't matter which one, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, headaches, any disease you can think of, represents a change in function, not a change in anatomy. So if you get diabetes, the functioning of your islet cells changes. If you get Alzheimer's, the functioning of your brain cells change. If you get cancer, the metabolic rate of cells in your body change. What doesn't change is anatomy. I mean, as the disease progresses, yes, you'll find anatomical changes. But in the genesis of the disease, the beginning of the disease, the fundamental structure of the disease is a change in how the body lives, not how the body looks. So we need a camera that shows function, not anatomy. That camera is called a PET scanner. It stands for Positron Emission Tomography. This is our newest instrument. It was installed just before Christmas. We've probably run a dozen patients so far, acceptance testing it. It's the highest resolution instrument that's out there. It's a mile from here. It's in the basement of the Feinstein. The thing that's really unique about the Feinstein is we have this instrument as well. So this is a human PET scanner. You can see by the gantry size, a whole body can go in here. We can scan a human head to toe. This is the same instrument. It's a PET scanner, but the gantry size here allows us to scan rats and mice. So this is an animal, a small animal PET scanner. It's very unique. There aren't many of them. And the power that it gives us is the ability to do basic science through this door and then come through this door to a patient. So it's a very unique setting in that we can do basic science and translate it to a human patient the next day. So it gives us enormous strength in terms of the speed with which we can advance our science. So PET scanning the first PET scanner was made in 1960 at Brookhaven Lab. Now, when I was in medical school in 1981, there were no clinical PET scanners. When I finished my residency in 1986, there were 4. 2 of them were at Brookhaven, 1 was at the University of Pennsylvania, and 1 was at Washington University in St. Louis. Today, in 2017, there are about 250 in the United States, so they're becoming very, very popular. They are the newest imaging technique out there for, in terms of the clinical utility, something you might experience it for, cancer. It's now the #1 tool for cancer because it allows us, how have we diagnosed cancer traditionally? Really one of 2 ways. You either felt the mass or you became symptomatic. Well, by the time you become symptomatic, the mass is big enough. By the time you feel the mass is big enough so the disease has progressed. What if you had an instrument that could see cancer when it's just a couple of cells? That's what a PET scanner could do, because a PET scanner looks at function. And in the disease of cancer, like any disease, function changes. So the PET camera allows us to see function as it's normal, under resting condition, and as it changes. PET measures function in all tissues. So just to make it really simple, for the most part, every cell in your body uses glucose for energy. So if a blastocyst, a bone cell, takes up sugar out of the blood because it needs to, right? Every cell needs energy. PET scans take advantage of that. We inject our patients with a radio-labeled sugar. So we take sugar, the same sugar that we eat, and we attach a short-lived radionuclide to it. It's got a 110-minute half-life. You inject it into the patient, and whenever any cell in your body needs sugar, it takes up sugar from the blood, and there's a small amount of radioactive sugar in the blood. It takes that up, and we can see it. Now, if a cell becomes metabolically active, it starts to divide like cancer cells, it takes up a lot of sugar. So all of a sudden, you have cells that taking up huge amounts of sugar, and they show up as a little tiny spot. So we can see it years before it's big enough to feel it. So you might ask, why would I have a PET scan? I'm not symptomatic, I don't feel a mass. Well, what if you have a family history? What if mom had breast cancer? What if dad had prostate cancer? So there's an enormous utility for PET scanning in the business of cancer. But we're here tonight to talk about how we use it to understand the disease of addiction. PET scans are really simple to read. Unlike the images you saw before that are all black and white, we put PET scans in color, primarily because it makes them easier to see and read. If you just remember colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, where red means that part of the brain is really active, lots of glucose being taken up, yellows and greens less active, blues and blacks not active at all. So in other words, if I put you in a PET scanner and I put a tennis ball in your right hand, and I ask you to squeeze that tennis ball while I'm scanning you for about 8 minutes, then I look at the image, the part of your brain that runs your right hand will have a bright red spot. It's really simple. It's no more complicated than that. But now you can kind of think about what can you do with the instrument. Well, we can have you recall a memory and see where the memory is stored. We can have you do mathematics and see where your brain does mathematics. We can have you read, see where your brain reads. We can have you watch things that you like and see where parts of your brain are that underlie pleasure. And we can show you things that are scary, and you can see where your brain responds to fear. It's really simple. So you'll have no trouble understanding the images. If you do, just ask me. So here we have, this is a normal PET scan in someone in their early 20s. Eyes are right up here. Single slice. Our machines are 65 slices. I just picked one in the middle. So here are 3 PET scans from 3 normal people. You can see as well as I can that they're really different. On the left is a 5-day-old baby. Now, I have 2 kids of my own, and I can tell you that when they were 5 days old, they couldn't do much. A 5-day-old baby doesn't do much, and there isn't anyone in this room who can remember being 5. You can't remember being 5 because your brain doesn't have the metabolic capability to encode memories. It doesn't have the metabolic capability to organize movements. 5-day-old baby can't roll over. 5-day-old babies can see light and dark, and they can nurse. That's about it. In the middle is a 6-year-old boy. Now, when my son was 6 years old, like all 6-year-olds, you know as well as I do, they're a pain in the ass, right? 6-year-old kids get into everything. They run around, they ask questions, they never stop, they pick on their sister, they pull the dog's tail. 6-year-old boys or girls are really active. Here we are. As we get older, our brain becomes less active. This is someone in their mid-30s. As we get older, our brain metabolism decreases. And that's perfectly normal. That's the way it's supposed to be. We start out with very little brain activity. We peak at about 8 years old, and then it's downhill from here on in, right? And when you're 95 years old, you have less than this. But remember, we have 95-year-olds who have much less activity than this, and they're perfectly with it. So the thing to not get confused with is this metabolic rate has nothing to do with cognition. It doesn't mean that the 6-year-old's smarter than the guy who's 35. The other way to look at it is we're able to do more with less, right? So the reason I show these images to you really is twofold. One, it kind of gives you the sense of the instrument, the sensitivity. We can see very little and we can see a whole lot. But for me, it's much more important for another reason, and that is that age matters. When I see 4th grade alcoholics, and we see lots of them, I have to compare the brain of a 4th grade alcoholic to a 4th grader who isn't. I can't compare a fourth grader to someone who's 35 because their brain changes with age. When I show you an image of a 12-year-old methamphetamine abuser, and we have a bunch, it's compared to a 12-year-old who isn't. So all the images that you'll see tonight are compared to age-matched controls. So just to give you a sense of the significance or the power of our instrument, this is a simple study that we did a few years ago to address the age-old question of depression. You know as well as I do that in the disease of depression, it's really diagnosed by talking to a professional or a psychiatrist or whoever who asks you a series of questions and interviews and develops something called a HAM score, and they tell you that you're depressed or you're not depressed. So it's kind of a very important interaction. Well, if you look at the statistics, some statistics would suggest that psychiatrists get it wrong 2 out of 3 times. That means that the diagnosis of depression, they're only right 1/3 of the time. It means they're wrong 2/3 of the time. So what we really need is some independent way to look at a brain to see if we can develop a metabolic signature or a metabolic fingerprint of a specific disease. This is a 21-year-old male. His eyes are right up here, normal PET scan. Here's a 22-year-old male, eyes are right up here, who suffers from depression. Now you can see as well as I can that in the disease of depression there is a profound decrease in brain metabolism. This is independent of whether or not they're having trouble sleeping at night, whether their feeding habits have changed. This is an independent assessment of brain metabolism. And what we've known from animal studies where we can breed animals who are genetically depressed, their brain metabolism is certainly lower. So it just shows you that we're now starting to get this instrument into my business in psychiatry and neurology and to start to develop metabolic signatures of psychiatric diseases. But if we're going to talk about addiction, we need to make some real simple statements. The first is that every single drug of abuse that's out there works the same way, whether it's the caffeine in your coffee or heroin on the street. They all work the same way. They increase a chemical in your brain called dopamine. We all have it. Everyone in this room, everyone in Manhasset, everyone on planet Earth has dopamine in their brain. It's a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical your brain makes. I can't give it to you. I can't give you a shot of it. I can't give you a pill of it. The dopamine that's in your brain has to make. Its primary role is movement. Every time you move any muscle, your brain has to release dopamine. It's really simple. You want to blink your eyelid, your brain releases dopamine. You want to move a hand, a finger, an arm, a leg, you have to release dopamine. You have to also get rid of it as soon as you make it, right? So if I'm going to release a chemical that allows you to move so I can move my hand, well, when I stop moving my hand, I got to get rid of that chemical. So we have a mechanism that produces it and a mechanism that gets rid of it. Primary role, movement. If you lose it, you develop a disease called Parkinson's. Parkinson's disease is a brain disease where you lose brain dopamine. If you've ever seen a Parkinson's patient, they have trouble moving. They have trouble initiating movement. They have trouble maintaining movement. When it gets really advanced, they have trouble making expressions with their face. And they get something called masked faces, where they can't even move the muscles in their face so they can't express. You know, we all express by moving the muscles in our face. We can tell, you can just look at someone and see if they're happy or sad, angry, perplexed. Someone with Parkinson's can't even move the muscles in their face, so they lose the ability to form expressions. So the classic role of dopamine is movement. It does something else. It's the chemical in your brain that allows you to feel pleasure, whether you're happy or sad. So the other night, the Patriots won. Now, I'm a Patriots fan. I don't care about you Jets fans or Giants fans. My son's a Jets fan, so that's fine. I'm a Patriots fan. When they won, I was really happy. When you're happy from a natural event, your favorite team wins, you're with your husband or wife, you're with your kids, it's Friday afternoon, whatever it is that makes you happy, your dopamine levels will go up 5 or 6%. A natural reward elevates dopamine 5 or 6%. Every single addictive drug that's out there does the same thing. They elevate brain dopamine. That's how they work. But the magnitude's a little different. If you're happy because your favorite sports team won 5 or 6%, if you take a dose of methamphetamine, which is in every school district on Long Island, 900,000%. 900,000. This is what we're up against in the drug abuse world. The happiest you've ever been, the best you've ever felt, your dopamine levels went up 5 or 6%. You use meth, 900,000. Heroin, 650,000. Cocaine, 300, 400,000. All of these are dose dependent. So from the most addictive drug, meth, 900,000, to the most commonly abused drug, caffeine, about 120%. Every addictive drug increases dopamine further than anything you will experience in your natural life. That's how they work. You take an addictive drug, dopamine levels go up, period. And they go up huge amounts. Next. So the question that we've always been facing, and one that has haunted us for as long as I've been in the business, is this notion that addiction's not a disease. That in fact, it is a moral weakness, a bad person, a character flaw, someone who is morally bankrupt, someone who just doesn't care, someone who's had bad parenting, someone who just is a bad person. I've heard this forever, and it's one of the things that, to be honest, that has delayed our ability to advance science for a long time. So now that we've had this amazing instrument of PET, we can really go in and look and see that, does addiction produce a disease? Is it a disease that has a basis, an organic basis that we can see? So over the years, we've gone to school districts across the country, asking kids, including this district, asking kids, how many of you will try anything once? And hands go up. And how many of you won't try anything once? And hands go up. And you know as well as I do, the kids will tell you about all the adrenaline junkies in the school. These are the kids who want to go on the newest roller coaster. They want to bungee jump from hot air balloons. They want to do all the newest things. They're the ones who are going to go to the midnight to Best Buy to get the game when it's released. They're the ones who wait on the 5 hours on the line at Apple for the new iPhone 7, right? You know. Now we go and we image those two brains. So we have a group of kids who say, no, I'm cool, I'm not interested in trying anything really new. And the kid, the adrenaline junkies as the kids call them, who will try anything. Now we image those brains. On the left is one of those kids who said, I'm cool, not interested in trying anything new, not interested in the newest roller coaster, I'm not interested in the bungee jumping from hot air balloons. Think about it. And with this PET scan, we're actually looking at brain dopamine. So one of the beauties of our instrument and any PET scanner is you can actually look at brain dopamine. You can get a measurement. I can tell you how much you have. The kid on the right is the adrenaline junkie. And lo and behold, the kid on the right's got about 5 or 6% more dopamine than this age-matched control. So here's the first key to the disease. We now have really good data that suggests that if you have a little bit more dopamine than you should for your age, the probability that you'll get addicted to something is 3 to 4 times higher if you try it. That means the disease of addiction is resident in brains before anyone does anything that's addictive. And the simple process of doing something that's addictive unmasks the disease. We see the same thing with diabetes. 3/4 of diabetics are diabetics because of their weight. They're not diabetics when they have a normal BMI. But when their BMI starts to go up, they unmask the disease of diabetes. Addiction is the same thing. It is a disease with an organic basis that is unmasked when you start to do things that potentiate that system. Well, so that was the first data set, and it was interesting because it said, okay, well, that explains the adrenaline junkies, but there's another disease that kids have with dopamine that doesn't seem to explain it. ADD and ADHD. ADD, attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a disease characterized by low brain dopamine. Here's our normal brain dopamine. Here's a kid with ADD. Well, we know that the kid who has ADD or ADHD, who doesn't get treated for it, has the highest likelihood of becoming a substance abuser. I have 2 kids, and I always say that if my 2 kids had had ADD or ADHD, I wouldn't have hesitated to put them on the medication, because the data shows time and time again that drugs used to treat the disease of ADD or ADHD actually prevent or protect the individual from becoming a substance abuser. Well, so now the story gets a little more complete. It doesn't look like the disease is one characterized by a little too much dopamine. It looks like it's a disease that's characterized by a change in dopamine, either too much or too little. And the manifestation is that if you have too much or if you have too little, the response to an addictive substance is all raised dopamine, unmasks the disease. So then that begs the obvious question. Well, okay, so if I have too much dopamine or I don't have enough, what are the metabolic consequences of that? So what? What does that mean? Well, here's our kid who has ADD. You saw him before or her before. And we give medication that raises brain dopamine, and that effectively treats the disease. But what if the kid doesn't get the medication and instead drinks? Here he is after he consumed alcohol. What happens? Yes. Right. So now here's the next so. The story's becoming more complete. The disease of addiction is one characterized by an alteration in brain dopamine, either too much or too little. Next, the estimate that's out there is 2/3 of people who have addiction disorder, who are addicted to a drug, are addicted because they're self-medicating a pre-existing condition. So the kid who has ADD or ADHD who does not get treated self-medicates. Drinks some alcohol, wow, feels better. Smokes some pot, oh, feel much better. So now we know that the consequence of an altered dopamine system is, 1, if they use something addictive, they unmask the disease. Why would they use something addictive? Because many of them self-medicate. Here's a very simple study with a young lady. 2 images of her brain. This is about at the level of her eyes. This is about at the level of her ears. Normal PET scan. Here she is high on pot. Not a terribly impressive study, very predictable. You smoke pot, brain metabolism drops. Dose dependent, the more you smoke, the more it drops. Sex independent, boys or girls. Classic textbook response to pot. You start with a normal metabolic brain, you get high, you get lower. Simple. But what if you start low? What if you're depressed? You saw this before. This was someone who's depressed. When he smokes pot, his brain metabolism goes up. So here's another example of how people, more commonly in men than women, kids in high school, more commonly boys than girls, who are depressed, if they don't get treated, they smoke pot, they feel better. So they're self-medicating their underlying depression. So the consequence of an altered dopamine system is that the response to an addictive substance is different. So if Johnny, who's sitting next to me, has an altered dopamine response, and the 2 of us take a shot of alcohol, he's going to feel it very differently than I am. So, the next question becomes an obvious one. Why if we accept that fundamental tenet that many kids who use drugs do so because they're adrenaline junkies and they want to try anything once. You should come with me sometime to high schools. More kids raise their hands than don't. So the question then is an obvious one. Well, if you're telling me that the reason some kids try drugs is because they want to try it, they want to do anything once, why do they do it twice? If they do it once and they're satiated, they do it once because they want to try something new, why do they do it again? Turns out the number 1 cause of relapse, the number 1 reason that people take drugs again and again and again is the environment. Well, when you say that to kids, their eyes roll back in their heads and they say, what the hell are you talking about? So we made a little study that was simple. We took advantage of the #1 abused drug in the world today, caffeine, and to address the simple effect of environment. What we did is we went out and we got 40 people who were going to serve as controls. These were 40 people who have no history of substance abuse, 18 years old to in their 60s. Brought them to our imaging center. They were all going to be controls. No history, right? I need an 18-year-old control, a 20-year-old control. Okay. The only requirement was they had to light coffee. That was it. Brought them to the imaging center, threw them in the camera. While I'm scanning them, I brew a pot of coffee in the next room. So experimental condition is real simple. I'm scanning someone, putting them in the camera, taking a picture, and while I take that picture, I am cueing them to a drug they like. I'm just letting them smell coffee. They couldn't have it. They didn't know I was going to do it. They couldn't have it at the end. Okay. And here's what we see. These are all 40 brains added up. This is a sagittal view of the human brain. Eyes are here, so you're looking at it like this. Coronal view, all 40 people are looking at you. Transaxial, eyes are here, feet are into the board. And what we see is striking in that it's an incredibly specific effect. In the absence of any drug, I gave them nothing. I simply cued them to a drug they like. A part of their brain turns on, and only that part turns on, and it's called the nucleus accumbens. You only see one here because it's only half the brain, 2 spots. Everyone in this room has a nucleus accumbens, and everyone uses it every day. It's the oldest part of your brain evolutionarily. It's the part of your brain that makes you get something you have to have. You use it all the time. Whenever you're thirsty, I just took a drink because I'm thirsty. When you're thirsty, your accumbens turns on and tells you to get water. When you're hungry, it turns on and tells you to get food. When you're in a place that isn't safe, it turns on and tells you to seek safety. It's the part of your brain that keeps you alive by directing you to get something you need. Well, in the world of substance abuse, when you produce that enormous increase in brain dopamine that makes you euphoric, your accumbens encodes everything about the environment you're in when you do it. And when you re-experience any part of that environment again, your accumbens turns on and tells you to get the drug. So it's the classic story that if you go smoke pot with your buddy on a Friday night, and next Wednesday you run into your buddy in school, your accumbens turns on and activates. I hear this time and time again. The thing that I hear the most is music. And the music that I hear most is Justin Bieber. I know. Kids get high listening to whatever they're listening to, and if they hear it again, they crave the drug. It's why the environmental cues, environmental triggers cause relapse. There is a reason that a gambling environment has tones, bells, and lights, because there's nothing more reinforcing than tones, bells, and lights. So it's really a consistent response, and it explains a whole bunch. We've seen it here too. Another study, really interesting, one of our newest studies. You see the same activation in the nucleus accumbens. This was a series of studies that we did where we brought someone in, a whole bunch, put them in the camera, and cued them. And lo and behold, their accumbens lit up. And this is what we cued them to, the internet. All we did was put them in a camera and said, instead of just hanging out, we're going to give you access to the internet. And all we did was boot it up, usually Gmail, Google, and their brain activates. There is a reason now why publications are starting to come out showing us that kids are getting addicted to the internet. If you want to see a brain really change, you put a kid in the pet camera and tell him when he goes in, I'm taking your cell phone away for 2 weeks. Xbox controllers. So this was done, so we can even go further. This was done also when you put them into the camera in a completely dark room, and you tell them we're going to put something in your hand. You're not going to be able to see what it is, but so you can put a pencil in their hand, pen. The minute you put a controller for Xbox, it activates. So it's just something to be aware of. We're now starting to look at internet addiction, gaming addiction, cell phone addiction. It's all part of the process. So back to caffeine. Here's our kid, normal PET scan. I gave him a 16-ounce can of Monster to drink. You all know what Monster is? Monster's like Red Bull. Here's his brain, 30 minutes after he drank it. Not surprising. There isn't anyone in this room. This shouldn't surprise any of you. We drink coffee. One, we like it, but two, it gives us a kick. I have a 2.5-hour commute every morning into Manhasset. So I drink a lot of coffee in the morning because I need my brain to be like this. So not surprising, not shocking, kind of predictable, dose dependent. What we didn't predict was the time course. I brought the kid back the next day and his brain was just like this. So we now know that a single dose of caffeine changes brain chemistry for 24 to 36 hours, which is odd because when I drink coffee in the morning and get to work, by 10 a.m. I'm ready for a nap, but my brain is like this. So here's the next piece of the puzzle. Every time you use an addictive drug, it'll change your brain for a lot longer than it'll change how you feel. The brain is really good at disconnecting how it feels from the underlying chemistry. Because in a real world, being high or being jacked up is not consistent with sustaining life. So your brain really quickly disconnects. And if you talk to any substance abuser, they use a drug, they get high, an hour later they're not high. So they want to get high again. Well, their brain is still changed. The next piece of this puzzle is one that shows how people use the very science that we generate. When your brain is this metabolically active, there is something around your brain called the blood-brain barrier. You kind of think of it as a fence. And it's a really special fence. And it keeps things out of your brain. If you didn't have a blood-brain barrier, the stuff you breathe out in the real world would get into your brain and wreak havoc. So you have a blood-brain barrier that prevents things from getting into your brain. When your brain is this metabolically active, the brain doesn't have enough energy to efficiently maintain that blood-brain barrier. So other stuff gets in smaller amounts. Well, someone took advantage of that and developed a drink called Four Loko. Four Loko is caffeinated alcohol. And the reason they made it was because they knew if they caffeinated the brain, more alcohol would get in. So it's a very simple way to deliver more alcohol in the same container. If we caffeinate it, more gets in. The number one drink in bars, at least in the state of New York, is Red Bull and vodka, because you can actually consume less vodka if you have Red Bull on board, because more alcohol gets into your brain. Smoking, real simple. This is a young lady, eyes are right here, normal PET scan, and in this study we're looking at a chemical in her brain called monoamine oxidase. I told you that if your brain releases dopamine to move my hand, your brain has to be able to get rid of it to stop. This is the chemical that gets rid of it to stop. Everyone has it. We're all born with it. Women have more than men, but we all have it. Unless you smoke. If you consume tobacco products, hookah, pipe, cigarettes, chewing tobacco, cigar, if you consume a tobacco product, you destroy the monoamine oxidase in your brain. It's a real simple effect. In fact, it's a dose-dependent effect. Normal, 1 puff in a cigarette, 3 puffs, 1 cigarette, 3 cigarettes. Dose-dependent. So, what does it mean? Well, first thing you should know is it's the only effect you'll see today that's reversible. That means if you stop smoking, it comes back. It takes about 55 days, but it comes back. So if you smoke for a month and quit, it comes back. 30 years and quit, it comes back. This is a reversible process. But it's also a process that is the result of, or the consequence of, secondhand smoke. So there isn't anyone in this room, myself included, who hasn't lost some monoamine oxidase. I grew up in a house of 2 alcoholics and 2 people who smoked. So I probably haven't had monoamine oxidase since I left for college, right? So anyway, we all have monoamine oxidase. We've all been exposed to secondhand smoke. We've all lost some. So what does it mean in the real world? It's really, really simple. If you have kids, and your kids are those kids who say, I'm not going to do anything, right? We got the kids who will do anything, the adrenaline junkies, and the other kids. Now, your kids who are the other kids go to a party, and at that party, people are smoking, and your kids are breathing in secondhand smoke. It doesn't take long, about 30 minutes, and they're starting to lose their monoamine oxidase. In about 60 minutes, they've lost most of it. Now, when you lose monoamine oxidase, it's what controls dopamine. What happens? Dopamine levels start to rise. So in about 90 minutes, the kid who walked in, who said, I'm not interested in doing things, all of a sudden has about 5% more dopamine in his brain, which is equal to the kid who said, I'll try anything. So this is what I hear time and time again. Kids will say, I don't know why the hell I did it. I've never done it before. I wasn't interested in doing it. All of a sudden, they go to a party, and it's, what the hell, I'll try ecstasy. We now know the consequence of secondhand smoke is a direct impact on monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase controls dopamine. When dopamine loses control, it elevates. When it gets about 5% higher, those are the kids who report willingness to try anything once. So, alcohol. There isn't a kid, probably in this room, who doesn't know all of these. I can go to elementary schools, I just did the other day, and every kid knows what these are. They don't know that this happens to my daughter's roommate in college, but it's my daughter's roommate in college doing a beer funnel, shotgun, keg stand. When my son was in high school, he told me he didn't drink. He's in here, took it off his computer playing beer pong. Everyone knows the ways that kids are taking alcohol. These are one of the newer ways. In the last 7 years, this has become the #1 drinking game in college campuses. It's called eyeballing. If you watch Stephen Colbert, he does a lot of skits on it. What kids are doing is taking bottles of alcohol, typically clear alcohol, they put their eye on it, they tip it up, and they get hammered. It's really common, and it's really painful. So you might ask, why the hell do they do it? Well, the reason they do it is really simple. If you go to a party and you drink alcohol, and then you leave that party and get into a car and drive away, and the cops pull you over, what do they give you? They give you a breathalyzer. Well, what if you never had alcohol in your mouth? Alcohol never was in your mouth. You got it into your body through your eye. It doesn't come out in your breath. So the reason kids are doing this is to circumvent getting caught. And it's very, very simple. Now, because it hurts so much, you might think, why are they doing it? Well, unfortunately, that's the game. We take the little sheet of paper out of the kid's pocket who comes in LOC unconscious, and it says, Billy, 8 minutes, 20 seconds, Michael, 4 minutes, 3 seconds. The game is how long you can keep the bottle up. You can go to any school, including Manhasset, and ask around who holds the record for the longest time. And kids know what the longest time is. It's 12 minutes and 40 seconds, right? So the thing that you need to be concerned about is this. The estimate for eyeballing is somewhere between a 4,000-fold increase to a 7,000-fold increase across college campuses. The reason that number is so high is because that number is based on self-report. When you ask kids if they do it, right, how honest are you going to get? But what isn't self-report is blindness. And what we're starting to see now is an increase in blindness in college campuses because kids who put alcohol in their eye lose their eyesight. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Some estimates are as high as 15%. In 2014, 2 papers were published looking at the amount of time it takes between your last eyeball experience and changes in vision. And those publications suggest 6 to 9 months. That means Johnny, who puts alcohol in his eye, who the next day has an epiphany that he's not going to do that again, 6 to 9 months from then, he can start to lose his sight. And it is progressive and irreversible. Next, if you drink too much alcohol, remember the classic college hazing was to throw a couple of kids in the trunk of a car with 3 bottles of Jack Daniels, and you shut the trunk lid, and you say, when they're all gone, we'll pop the lid. And you know as well as I do, several hundred kids a year die from alcohol poisoning because too much alcohol consumed is toxic. But if you consume too much alcohol, what do? You vomit. Simple. The reason you vomit is because alcohol is a toxin. Well, if you put alcohol in your eye, you can't vomit. So all of a sudden, alcohol becomes much more lethal. So it's just as a standard, I always tell the kids, because they always ask, standard rule of thumb is a shot glass of alcohol full in a 125-pound female, 150-pound male. If they drink it, do one shot, in 10 to 12 minutes, they may or may not feel it. But that dose in an eye can be fatal. Because our eyes are balls full of water. That water is called aqueous humor. And for the chemists, you remember that water goes where alcohol is, alcohol goes where water is. When you put that bottle up, your eyeball fills up with alcohol. And alcohol goes into the bloodstream. The eye is a highly vascular organ, so the alcohol level in your BAC goes up very quickly. So not only is it detrimental in terms of vision, but it increases the lethality. And we see it in every district. We see it here in Manhasset. We see it in Montauk. You can go to schools and ask the kids how long, what the record is. The other thing we're seeing is this. Tamping has become very common from middle school up to high school. You can imagine the response when I talk to kids. The typical response is guys look over at the girls and they call them, figures, women, figures. Fact of the matter is this is more common in men than it is in girls. More guys are tamping than women. And it's exactly what you think it is. And if you ask why, you'll get a bunch of answers. The most common answer you'll get is because it's completely undetectable. I can sit in class hammered and no one knows. It's not on my breath, my eyes aren't bloodshot, I don't smell like alcohol, my face isn't flushed, and they're just hammered. Now the consequence you can imagine in women, a single dose can produce sterility. In men, a single dose can produce, the easiest way to think of it is alcohol is a drying agent. You know when they put the alcohol swab on your arm, it turns cold because it dries the skin. Well, when you use it rectally, it dries the colon. When you dry your colon, it tears, colon tears. When your colon tears, you get septic. Sepsis kills more people in hospitals than anything else. So it's becoming more and more common, and one of the reasons is when my kids used to come home from parties, Dad would stay up, and if kids came in and their eyes were bloodshot, Dad would say, "What's going on with the eyes? What the hell?" And they'd say, "Oh, I was at a party, a lot of smoke." All right. But if you come home with a single bloodshot eye, that isn't going to sell. Now, kids are smart enough to not eyeball both eyes because the specific gravity of alcohol is a little different than water, and when you put alcohol in your eye, you really can't see through your eye while that alcohol is in it. So they're smart enough to know not to do both eyes because then they'll be walking into walls. So when kids come home with one bloodshot eye, the smoke in the room thing doesn't sell. But if they use a tampon, right? And you've heard about vaping. Vaping has become very common for one very simple reason. It's very, very fast. I told you that if you do a shot of alcohol, depending on your weight, you may or may not be buzzed in 10 to 12 minutes. Well, if you talk to a high school kid, 10 to 12 minutes is a lifetime. They want to get buzzed quickly. Well, the way to get buzzed quickly on any drug is to inhale it because of your tidal volume in your lungs is so large and it gets into your bloodstream so fast. So what kids are doing is they're taking advantage of the vapor pressure of alcohol. If you heat alcohol up just a little bit, it vaporizes and comes off as a gas. So what kids are doing is they're taking usually tiny little bottles, little glass bottles, or little shot glasses, put a paper cup upside down over top with a Bic lighter and hold the Bic lighter under it. So it heats the alcohol up. The alcohol gas fills in the empty cup. They pick the cup up and breathe in the cup. And in 90 seconds, they're getting buzzed. So the reason people are vaping alcohol is because they can get a buzz between periods in classes, right? A typical high school 3 to 4 minutes between a bell change. They vape so they can get a buzz as they change classes. What does alcohol do to the brain? It's very, very simple. This is a normal control, 22-year-old male, 2 levels of his brain. Here he is drunk. Not rocket science, again, pretty predictable. When you drink alcohol, you get metabolically blunted. The more you drink, the more the blunting. Simple, straightforward, dose-dependent, sex-independent, boys or girls. What we didn't envision in this effect was the same thing we didn't envision with caffeine, and that's the time course. With caffeine, it took 24 to 36 hours to return to normal. With alcohol, it takes between 5 and 7 days. So if you drink alcohol on a Friday night or a Saturday night thinking that you're going to go to school Monday with a normal brain, not even close. It's not until the following Thursday or Friday that your brain has returned to its normal metabolic state. Now, when you're hypo-metabolic like this, the ability to store and encode memories is impaired because, believe it or not, it takes energy to store a memory. It takes energy in your brain to learn. When you're hypo-metabolic like this, it takes you longer and it's much less efficient to learn. So in other words, you're not going to do as well in school because you can't encode and recall the memories and things that you're learning. So what kids are doing, it's pretty straightforward. They start out with a normal metabolic rate, they drink and it drops, and in 5 to 7 days it returns. And they drink and it drops, and 5 to 7 days later it returns. And they continue to do that until they reach a point where that game ends. On the left is a 51-year-old male, eyes are right up here, normal PET scan. In the middle is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who hasn't had a drink in over 20 years. So now we know that the disease of alcoholism is one whereby at some point in time, your brain says, this is my new normal. It's simple thermodynamics. It takes less energy to be here than it does here. So your brain learns, and it says, okay, I'm going to be here. And I'm never going back to here unless I drink. This is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who's drunk when I took the picture, and his PET scan's normal. If you ever ask an alcoholic why they drink, the number one answer is, I drink to feel normal. I don't drink to get drunk. And that's exactly what we see in the disease. That the alcoholic has a hypometabolic brain, and when he or she drinks, the brain returns to a normal metabolic state. So you think about the disease, think about why it's so difficult to treat. The drug alcohol produces the metabolic state, and then all of a sudden, the treatment for that metabolic state is the very drug they were using to get there. So they use alcohol, get to that state, and consume alcohol to medicate that state. It's called a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loops in biology are lethal. A positive feedback loop is very simple. Something happens, and because it happens again. And because it happens again and again and again. Everything in biology is negative. If something happens, the system is triggered to shut it off. It's negative feedback. You release insulin, sugar drops, insulin stops. You eat sugar, triggers insulin to be released, insulin drops, sugar drops, insulin shut off. Everything in life is a negative feedback loop. The only exception is childbirth. When you're delivering a baby, you get contractions. One contraction leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to more and more and more until you give birth. That is a positive feedback loop. The disease of alcoholism becomes a positive feedback loop, which is why it's so difficult to treat. I get asked a lot about family histories, and we have some very good data based on epidemiology data that we have known for a long time. And that is, if you look at alcoholics across the United States, about a third of them have an alcoholic history. Mom or dad was an alcoholic prior to their conception. So we did the study where we looked at kids born of a single alcoholic parent. Mom or dad was an alcoholic prior to that child's conception. And what we found is that about a third of kids born of a single alcoholic parent, they have a dopamine system consistent with the disease of alcoholism. It doesn't mean they're going to be an alcoholic. I always have to stress this a lot. If mom or dad was an alcoholic, it does not mean you're going to be one, even if you're this. All that means is that you have a system that if you choose to drink alcohol might get unmasked for the disease of alcoholism. All it means is if your mom or dad was an alcoholic, had a kid, and they were alcoholic before they conceived the kid, that kid should be counseled. That's it, which simply means, look, mom or dad was an alcoholic. You should know that if you go to college, you go somewhere and you drink alcohol, there's a chance that your response to alcohol is going to be very different than your friends. You see this all the time. Groups of kids, one kid gets hammered on a beer and another kid's drinking 15 of them, right? So there is clearly a genetic predisposition to the disease consistent with the epidemiology, the presence of the disease. Pot, let's just cut to the chase on pot. We didn't have a whole lot of good data on pot simply because no one just uses pot. So it's really hard to get just pot users. Everyone uses everything else. Until the great state of Colorado came around, and our colleagues got together and we scanned a whole bunch of adolescents, about 500 of them, and looked at their brains. And then they started to smoke pot, and we've been following them since. Marijuana does a very unique thing. It alters just the front part of the brain. Here are the eyes, front part of the brain, here are the eyes, front part of the brain. During adolescence, the last part of your brain to mature is your frontal lobes, the part of the brain just above your eyes. They don't mature until you're 23 or 24. It's why, this is for the parents, teenagers do the craziest stuff. My two kids, I used to sit there and go, what the hell did you do that for? Right? Because teenagers don't have a developed frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe is that part of your brain that allows you to take data points, integrate them, and make a decision based on those data points and the consequence of time. To a senior in high school, the future's tonight. To you and I as adults, the future is years. Well, if you don't have a frontal lobe and you can't timestamp things, then all of a sudden their relevance to future is meaningless. So the teenager makes decision and does crazy things, not because they're crazy, but because their brain hasn't grown up yet. Now, if you smoke pot, you arrest, you stop frontal lobe development. So what that means is if you're 15 years old and you start smoking pot and you quit when you're 25, at 25 you've got a frontal lobe that's 15. And at 25 when you quit, it'll start to grow. But your frontal lobe is an integral part of your development. It's the part of your brain that allows you to make executive decisions. You know as well as I do, the 16-year-old or 17-year-old that's approaching the intersection on the orange light steps on it and blows through the intersection, right? You and I at least look to see if there's a cop. And maybe we look to see if there's someone behind us. So if we slam on the brake, the guy in the back isn't up our ass, right? So, but the adolescent doesn't put data points together. And the thing that's so troubling about pot during adolescence is it arrests that part of the brain that allows you to make executive decisions. The risk that kids take by using pot to advance to other drugs is incredibly high. Now, I always have to say, because it used to be thought that pot was the gateway drug. Smoke pot tonight and tomorrow you're using cocaine. The data don't support it. Data don't say that it's the gateway drug. You want a gateway drug? The gateway drugs are inhalants, sniffing things. In elementary schools, I go to them all the time. Kids steal Sharpies. You all know what Sharpies are? And they take Sharpies and they take the caps off, they put 3 of them in a bag and they breathe them and they get hammered. Now, if you want to look at the greatest predictor for illicit drug abuse, it's not pot, it's inhalants. Kids who abuse inhalants in elementary school have the highest likelihood of going on to other substance abuse. The trouble with pot, though, is it delays cognitive development. I mean, it arrests your brain's ability to make the kinds of decisions one needs to make as we get older. You know, when you're 6 years old, it doesn't matter if you do something that's going to impact your savings account in 30 years. But when you get to be 18, 19, or 20, you kind of need to think beyond tonight. So one of the things that I get asked is secondhand smoke. Kids will say to me all the time, I don't smoke pot, but I go to places where there is pot being smoked. Secondhand pot smoke does the exact same thing. I think you all know that what's becoming very popular is vaping anything. You saw they're vaping alcohol. Well, they're vaping pot too, and they're vaping it in 2 ways. One, they're vaping the cannabinol oil itself. So THC oil used to be called Thai sticks when I was in medical school. It's an oil that's very high concentrations of THC. They'll vape the oil, or they'll actually vape the bud of a plant. Now, the data that's out there, if you actually look at the data that's out there about the health risks of vaping pot, what you'll find is it's actually safer, vaping is actually safer with respect to the other consequences of the material that is in the marijuana plant itself. Because when you smoke a joint, the temperature in a joint from the flame is about 1,200 degrees. That volatilizes everything in a pot plant. You know, and there's thousands of molecules in a pot plant. Vaping raises the temperature slowly and just to the temperature where you volatilize THC. So you're not volatilizing any of the other crap. So it's safer with respect to the consequences of the second stuff in pot. Rule of thumb, it's real simple. The risk of lung cancer in smoking cigarettes is about 7%. The risk of lung cancer smoking pot is about 13%. The risk is a little higher for pot than it is for tobacco because of the heat at which you're volatilizing. Okay. But if you vape, that risk goes away. The problem is when you vape, you aerosolize the higher concentration of THC. So they're getting a bigger dose. So the risk of the secondhand stuff, the other crap, the tar and nicotine, the tar and carbon products and tobacco that you get when you smoke a cigarette, you don't get if you vape it. So we always talk about vaping is safer with respects to the secondhand effects. It is more toxic with respect to the concentration of THC that the kids are getting. Spice is synthetic pot. You used to be able to buy it in all the bodegas. Used to be able to get it at 7-Eleven. The genesis of it was really simple. Kids were getting arrested for drug abuse. They were being released. If they had a dirty urine, they got brought back in. So they came up with a way to make a drug like pot that doesn't show up in your urine so you don't get reincarcerated. That drug is spice. Spice is synthetic pot. Spice is something that has never seen a plant. It is mixed typically with potpourri or stuff out of lawn clippings, and people smoke it. Now, it produces a high just like every other drug does via the same mechanism. It raises brain dopamine. But it raises it in a unique way. It raises it by depriving the brain of oxygen. You've all heard of autoerotic asphyxiation, where if you deprive blood to the brain during some events, you can potentiate that event. It's very common that kids will restrict blood supply to the brain so they can potentiate the high. They do this when they're drug dose, when they don't have enough of the drug. So if they're using a drug to get high but they don't have enough of it, they'll actually constrict blood supply. They'll have their friend strangle them while they're getting high to potentiate the high. That's what spice does. Spice drops your oxygen saturation, which gets you buzzed. Well, every organ in your body has its Achilles heel. The Achilles heel for your brain is oxygen. Your brain, you can box, you can play in the NFL, you can take all kinds of drugs. What you cannot do is deprive it of oxygen. You deprive your brain of oxygen and stuff goes south real quick. That's what spice does. It gets you high by depriving your brain of oxygen. When you deprive your brain of oxygen, dopamine levels go up. When dopamine levels go up, you feel euphoric. But the consequence of anoxic of episodes is frontal cortex damage. That manifests most commonly in paranoia, the consequence of which is usually aggression. Kids who use spice usually become very aggressive because they become so paranoid. Ecstasy. Ecstasy is a drug the kids will tell you. They tell me every week. Physicians can write prescriptions for it. In the 1970s, it was prescribed. It was a drug that was used to, believe it or not, help young married couples who were having trouble. And the theory behind it was if I give them both ecstasy, they'll open up and talk better and maybe be able to work out whatever their issues were. In fact, it has a very profound effect on the brain. It increases brain dopamine like every other drug, but it does something else. These are PET scans of 3 individuals. Here, instead of looking at dopamine, we're looking at a chemical called serotonin. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter. Its primary role is mood. People who get depressed have low serotonin levels. we give SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, to treat depression. It's really simple. So here's your serotonin system in the human brain. Serotonin overlaps the distribution of dopamine, but its highest concentrations is in your brainstem. This is an individual who uses ecstasy. You can see that they're starting to kill off serotonin cells. When you kill off serotonin cells, serotonin drops. When serotonin drops, people get depressed. The number one cause of suicide in high schools is an ecstasy-induced depression. Because you actually kill the cells, no medication works. I put this up because the most common thing a kid will say to me is, yeah, well, at least I'm not using acid, LSD. This is LSD. It binds to the same place that ecstasy does, works through the same mechanisms, and it doesn't cause the cell death that ecstasy does. So when kids say to me, well, at least it's not acid, it'd be better if it were. Acid is less toxic. Now, one of the things that serotonin does besides mood is it regulates your core temperature. We're all sitting here at 98.6, plus or minus. The reason we're sitting at 98.6 is the serotonin's regulating your core temperature. Well, when you use ecstasy, you kill serotonin cells on contact. When you lose serotonin cells, you lose the ability to regulate core temperature. And your body temperature goes up to 105, 106, and it's fatal. You saw 2 years ago in Stamford, Connecticut, 14 kids. 7 of them died because they became hyperthermic and went up to 105 and died. So the classic thing you'll see with serotonin is kids will hydrate 2 bottles of water before the party, and they'll cover themselves in Vicks. Vicks, everyone know what Vicks is? It's that stuff my mom used to put on me as a kid when I had a cold. Right, Vicks Vapor Rub. They'll cover themselves in that because it lowers their core temperature. Let's get to the biggest deal that we're dealing with now, are the opiates. I think everyone knows the opiate issue was born out of prescription medication. Just because a prescription can be written for a drug does not mean it's a safe drug. We know that doctors have overwritten. It's very simple. No one gets addicted to an opiate in the presence of pain. People get addicted to opiates in the absence of pain. So if you have something done that warrants narcotic pain management, take your narcotic pain management. The problem is if you go and have an appendectomy and you need narcotic pain management for 4 days and your doc writes you for 60 days, the minute you're no longer in pain and you take that next oxy, that's when addiction occurs. In my school district out east, I can buy an oxy for 25 bucks. Heroin abusers are using 100 to 150 pills a day. You can do the math. 25 bucks times 150 pills is a lot. You can buy heroin 10 to 15 doses for 4 bucks. You can have it delivered to your door. It produces a profound hypometabolic state. It produces a disease called a leukoencephalopathy, which is like MS. And I will end on methamphetamine because it's the most addictive drug we've ever seen. It comes in all different colors. It's in every school district on Long Island. This is my daughter when she was 12 years old. This is what a 12-year-old brain should look like. You've seen it before. Dopamine bilaterally symmetrical, both sides. And when you're 12, you even have some dopamine in your frontal lobe. This is a 12-year-old girl who got into methamphetamine in her house and she ate it, and she's lost more than 95% of her brain dopamine. Methamphetamine is the compound that the guy was making in Breaking Bad. You talk to kids and they'll say, oh, Breaking Bad, all that meth. This is what methamphetamine does. She is now, 6 months after her dose, paralyzed, blind, deaf. She can't feed herself, can't go to the bathroom herself. She's in a fetal position. Her 6-year-old sister's in the same condition. My daughter is now 28, and so is she. She will live the rest of her life with END, E-N-D, stage Parkinson's disease. And finally, I'll just end on this. When we talk to kids about meth, they'll tell us that I hear all kinds of things. The biggest issue we have is when we bring people in to study marijuana, 200 people in our protocols every year. A couple of years ago, we brought in our 200 people. All of them said they didn't use meth. 3/4 of them tested positive for meth. They didn't lie to us. Some of them did, but they didn't all. So we had them bring their pot, and we tested it, and it had meth in it. So on Long Island, Nassau County, Suffolk County, the number that's out there is about 70% of the pot that's out there has methamphetamine in it. That means kids are getting it. Now, I've been talking to kids a long time about this, to the point where kids now say to me, well, you know what, now I take my pot and I dump it out on a table and I pick the meth crystals out of it. If they're picking meth crystals out of their pot, the problem's worse than I thought. You just need to be aware, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, pot was laced with angel dust, PCP. That was classic. Today, because meth is so cheap and they can make it by the ton, it's laced in pot. So I'm going to end there. Anyone has questions, comments, insight? I'd be happy to answer any question anyone has. Thank you guys for coming out. I really appreciate it.